Okay guys, today we're going to be talking about our third topic in biochemistry, which is chemical reactions and enzymes. So if we look at this graph here, this looks like a fairly complicated graph, but in actuality it's very simple, and I'll explain it in a few minutes. But this is a chemical reaction graph. All right, and we did talk about these really briefly last year, so this will be a review. This spinning structure might look familiar with its alpha helices and its beta sheets in here. This is actually the tertiary structure of a protein. Specifically, it is a tertiary structure of an enzyme protein. And enzymes are going to be important in determining certain aspects of chemical reactions. So these two are often interlinked because of the interdependence of chemical reactions on enzymes in the human body. So first, let's start out with a little review from last year. We talked about the general chemical reaction formula. And if you remember, on the left-hand side of the formula, you have your reactants. Okay, your reactants are the molecules that are actually undergoing the chemical reaction. They are going to be changed. All right, and they are changed during the reaction, so the arrow indicates the reaction. So during the reaction, your reactants are changed into your products. Okay, and you can have multiple reactants that either get put together or they change by either synthesizing into larger products, or you could have a single reactant that gets digested into multiple products. It depends on the reaction. Okay, so I'll give you two examples. One example you might be familiar with from Mr. Balco's class. So you guys talked about photosynthesis. And I know you guys are familiar with this because you guys have talked about it a few times, especially last year. So if you remember, photosynthesis is a biochemical reaction because first of all, it is a chemical reaction. You do see the arrow here. But it is bio because it happens in animals. It happens in organisms, specifically plants, not animals. Us animals wish we could do it, but unfortunately, we did not evolve that way. So plants undergo this biochemical process called photosynthesis. So the reactants for photosynthesis include carbon dioxide, CO2, water, or H2O. And even though it's technically not a reactant, it's important for the chemical reaction to happen, so you need an energy source, or solar energy, so sunlight. But if we actually do look at the reactants themselves, water and carbon dioxide are your reactants. Now, when these undergo your chemical reaction, indicated by the arrow, they actually break their chemical bonds between the carbon and the oxygen, between the hydrogen and the oxygen here, and they end up creating glucose, C6H12O6. And in addition to glucose, they create oxygen gas. So this is a synthesis reaction. Okay, and again, it's indicated by the word photosynthesis. Okay, they use solar energy to synthesize a larger molecule. But what really happened here is you have two reactants that were combined to create completely different products. So your products are going to be different chemicals than your reactant. That is a chemical reaction. Now, conveniently, we have the reactants for another equation that you guys might be familiar with. So if we take C6H12O6 and combine that with oxygen in our cells, and specifically in our mitochondria, so again, these are our reactants, we end up getting, yep, you guessed it, CO2 and H2O. Plus this molecule, ATP which is used as an energy exchange molecule. Okay, ATP we talked about last week. It's a nucleotide. So we create ATP molecules through the process of cellular respiration. So this is also, this, even though it does create ATP, this is more of a digestion reaction because you're breaking down glucose back into smaller components. Okay, and so this would be a synthesis reaction up here, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration is more of a digestion reaction that occurs in your cells. However, the important thing that you guys need to realize is that these chemical reactions both have similar characteristics. In both, your reactants undergo a chemical reaction to create completely new products. Okay? And that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day. So one thing I like to equate chemical reactions to are, let's say you were trying to roll a boulder over a hill. So your parents got mad at you, they give you some chores, they're like, here, roll these boulders to the bottom of the hill. However, in order to get them to point B, you need to get them up this hill first. And depending on the size of the hill, okay, rolling that boulder over the hill will be easy and it'll be hard. So think of it this way. If you have a really high hill like this, okay, this is going to take a long time. If you have a really short hill, this will be shorter amount of time. Okay? In a reaction, it's the same thing. So if this was a chemical reaction, just like the person rolling the rock up a hill, you need to use more energy. So energy needs to be put into the reaction in order to get it from point A to point B. That energy, the amount of energy, that hill, is called your activation energy. Okay? So activation energy is the energy needed to be added to a reaction in order to get the reactants at A to react in order to create the products B. So even though this looks relatively simple, okay, it really is, but if we actually look at a chemical reaction graph, there's really not much difference. So if we look at this chemical reaction graph, the left side would be our reactants, and the right side would be our products. So in order to get from our reactants to our products, we need to reach this point here, which is our activation energy. So this is the amount of energy that needs to be put in to the reaction in order to get from reactants to products. Okay? So if we take this basic chemical reaction graph and we take a look at it in a little bit more depth, we can talk about how some reactions happen faster than others, whereas some happen slower than others. So let's take a look at two reactions. One reaction, which is paper and oxygen. Okay, this is actually, believe it or not, something that you are familiar with, even though it may not seem it. And baking soda instead of water. I apologize, this should be vinegar. Okay, well, let's take a look at the paper and oxygen one first. You're all taking notes right now. You have your paper in front of you. There's oxygen gas surrounding your paper. So if paper and oxygen undergo a chemical reaction, why isn't your paper going up in flames? Well, the reason is because the reaction for paper and oxygen is one that has a very, very, very high activation energy. So your paper and oxygen, your reactants, need to have a lot of energy put into them to reach their activation energy point here. Only then can they react and form your products, which include water, carbon dioxide, and your energy release, which is typically associated with fire or flame. However, paper and oxygen don't just randomly do this, and the reason is because you need to put a lot of energy in. So in order to get these to react, you usually have to set them on fire or put energy in, such as flame from a lighter or a match. And that is the addition of your activation energy, the addition of the flame. Okay? So when you have high activation energy, it takes a lot of energy to start reacting, and therefore the reaction happens slowly. And in this case, if you just left paper and oxygen out, if you didn't add any energy, if you didn't add fire or flame, it would never happen at all. So it happens so slowly, or sometimes not at all. Now on the other hand, we have baking soda with vinegar. Now baking soda and vinegar, I can mix the two together and the reaction will happen instantaneously. Why? Well, unlike paper and oxygen, baking soda and vinegar have a very short or low activation energy. So the reactants are here and your products are here. And in order for the reactants to get to your products, there's only a very short hill. Okay, so just like rolling the rock over the hill, what's going to happen faster? If you had to roll a rock over this hill, that would happen very slowly. If you had to roll a boulder over this hill, you would be able to do it much quicker with less energy. So your activation energy is low, and therefore it takes little energy to start the reaction. So your baking soda and your vinegar mixed together, very little energy is needed, and they can pretty much instantaneously go to your product without taking the time to get to your activation energy. And therefore, it happens very, very quickly. So this is a very important concept when talking about enzymes, and tomorrow's lecture we'll talk about why. So look forward to that. I know I am. About half of you are probably rolling your eyes right now. But enjoy the rest of your night, and I will see you tomorrow in class.